Hello and welcome to Devil's Advocate. Where does the Bharatiya Janata Party stand on key aspects of the Lokpal? That's the critical issue I shall discuss today with the leader of the opposition in the Rajya Sabha, former Law Minister Arun Jaitley. Arun Jaitley, earlier this week you published an article on the Lokpal on the BJP website. Does this represent your party's official position or only your personal viewpoint?
Well, it indeed represents my party's official position. We've had a considerable amount of discussion within the party, and this represents in substance on some of the important issues what the consensus in the party is about.
Now, earlier this morning I interviewed Nitin Gadkari, the president of the BJP, and he says that these are simply your personal views, that the BJP hasn't decided its viewpoint on these issues and will only make it public after the government has tabled the bill in Parliament.
No, officially we will be making our stand public on the bill after the bill has made public. On the draft prepared by the ministers, this is a reaction which we prepared within the party.
So this is what you think of the draft prepared by the ministers? All right, let's then discuss your article and some of the issues that you've raised. To begin with, there are issues to do with the jurisdiction of the Lokpal. You say that the Prime Minister must be brought within the ambit of the Lokpal, but with certain exclusions. Does this mean that you don't accept the argument that bringing the Prime Minister under the Lokpal would hobble him and would create political instability?
You see, since 1968, when the first Lokpal bill was introduced in Parliament, we've now had almost 4.5 decades of discussion on this subject. The last 3-4 bills which have been introduced, with or without exceptions, had the Prime Ministerial provision in the Lokpal bill. The final was, after a considerable discussion in the NDA government, the 2001 bill was introduced. Prior to that, the 1998 bill, both of which had a similar provision. And I think the NDA bill, to which all of us were a party, there was a considerable amount of discussion. In fact, the standing committee tactically approved it, and which had a provision that there are some aspects of the prime ministerial functioning, particularly the ones which relate to national security, which relate to maintenance of public order, where you must leave the Prime Minister out, because these are very sensitive areas for the country itself, and you can't have any institution probing them.
But that apart, the Prime Minister
apart, there are many functions which are purely commercial or political in character.
Except that what is the logic of the exclusions? Because if you choose to leave public order, national security, and as you said to the Times of India in an interview, also foreign affairs out, then if there were to be a repeat of Bofors, the issue couldn't be examined by the Lokpal at all.
I don't think taking a kickback on a deal is national security. In fact, even during the Bofors debate, it was clear, just because what you are purchasing is weapons and not trucks, it's not national security.
The Prime Minister could argue that it affects foreign affairs, it affects national security.
No,
that would be an argument that would work against your interest.
No, I'm afraid that's not an acceptable argument. National security would be something when you are dealing with insurgency, when you are dealing with cross-border terrorism, when you are dealing with strategic
What
areas.
About foreign affairs? You mentioned foreign affairs and as an exclusion to the Times of India.
I think the journalist understood we've been sticking to those two phrases. Now, some aspect of these may be covered under foreign affairs, and therefore, if the government wants to expand this area for some reason, we are in fact willing to have a discussion on this. But an absolute immunity to the Prime Minister, for instance, I have given 2 illustrations. He receives kickbacks on a commercial deal. He bribes to get a majority in Parliament. Now, would such areas should be excluded as far as the Lokpal bill or investigation against corruption is concerned?
Except for the fact that what you've come up with is a sort of halfway house. Cover the Prime Minister under the Lokpal but have exclusions, and that to me suggests that it's a compromise that gives you the worst of both worlds. You have neither perfect scrutiny nor immunity.
It's a perfectly responsible position. Everybody is accountable for corruption. The higher the office you hold, the higher should be the standards of accountability. But in larger national interest, there could be areas of national security or public order where you could exclude the Prime Minister for an inquiry.
Except for the fact that those 2 heads alone, and if you add foreign affairs, as sometimes you suggest you will, then those 3 heads have so many subjects that come under them that allegations of corruption are bound to come up, and if they do, the Prime Minister would have immunity.
I think you can't expand commercial aspects from to be included in these areas. These areas are specific, and those in government know that these areas are clearly defined.
You're sure that this is not a messy compromise, the worst of both worlds?
But I think this idea has evolved after 43-year debate, and in the last 15 to 20 years, this idea actually gained substance. So parliamentary committees have approved it, legislations introduced by the government had this provision. It's nothing new that we are saying.
All right, let's then come to the second area where there is controversy over the jurisdiction of the Lokpal. You believe, and I take it that this is now your party's viewpoint as well, that judges should be covered not by the Lokpal but by the National Judicial Commission. The problem is that under the National Judicial Commission, the majority of people to whom they'll be accountable will be fellow judges. You want to escape from judges judging judges, you're retaining the same problem.
No, I think you must understand the position of judiciary within Indian democracy. Independence of judiciary is extremely important, to which we are now adding accountability of judiciary.
But accountability to judges only.
The present arrangement is only judges judge judges. That's the in-house mechanism. The exception area is impeachment, where parliament judges judges, but that's the rarest of rare cases. Now, over the last 2 decades, a reasonable thought has matured. The left has been saying it, many other parties have been saying it. In fact, I had introduced a constitution amendment in Parliament.
In 2003?
In 2003, but which was only with regard to appointments.
So,
and which said, and I just tell you, which said, you have a body which has a somewhat primacy for the judicial institution, but which has a representative of the government, which may have a representative of the citizenry, that is some eminent citizen, through an appointment mechanism. And therefore, these people really should constitute the appointment mechanism. Today, I have suggested that normal cases of judicial indiscretions or misdemeanors should also be included in this, so that this becomes the integrity institution as far as the judiciary is concerned. I don't want a situation where executive judges judges. I don't want a situation where exclusively the judges judge the judges. Now, this is a combination which again has evolved over a debate of the last 20 years, and you have many political parties in India.
Can I interrupt? I've given you a lot of time to answer that at length. The problem with the mechanism that you're suggesting, the National Judicial Commission, is that it will have a vast majority of members who are judges, only 2 non-judges, the law minister and a watchdog person, an eminent person from society. Once again, judges are judging judges.
I can tell you, some retired important judges met me just now. In the course of a discussion, they said, we want to suggest an alteration to the proposal. And instead of 1, you have 2 eminent citizens. Fair enough. I have also in my article said that the composition can be a matter of debate. Except I am one of those who believe that a National Judicial Commission must necessarily give primacy to the judicial institution,
the problem is,
but have participation of others also.
If the participation of others is only a minimum minority and the participation of judges is the vast majority, which is what everyone seems to suggest, and so does your article, then the problem is this. The sanctioning authority to grant permission for an investigation of a sitting judge will be his colleagues, his friends, perhaps judges who sit on the same bench as him. They will bend to his side and his favor.
Once a National Judicial Commission comes to a particular finding, you can vest that authority by legislation in the National Judicial Commission itself.
I'll tell you why this is not satisfactory, because as Prashant Bhushan has repeatedly said, there are innumerable allegations of corruption against judges, but the Chief Justice of India has only in a small handful of cases given permission for investigation.
Therefore,
the same will apply here. Judges will protect judges.
Therefore, don't suggest a remedy which is worse than the problem. Don't get a government-dominated Lokpal to start judging judges. Still have a balanced National Judicial Commission and vest the power of granting a sanction with the same commission.
Can you then ensure that the National Judicial Commission doesn't have a majority of sitting judges, but perhaps only 50%?
I think the composition of a National Judicial Commission could be a matter of discussion, could be a matter of improvement. Over the suggestions I have given. In fact, in my article, I have suggested that we should be open to improvement and suggestions as regards the composition. I am willing for it. But time has now come to constitute a National Judicial Commission, because judicial independence and judicial integrity is something which this country must always maintain.
All right, and you've conceded that the composition can be debated, and perhaps you'll also concede that perhaps 50% of the NJC should be non-judges.
I'm not getting into percentages at the moment, but I quite agree that the composition can be a matter of discussion and even improvement.
Okay, let's then come to the third area where the jurisdiction of the Lokpal is being contested and debated. The question is, should the behavior of MPs in terms of their voting and their speaking within Parliament, if the shadow of corruption comes over it, fall under the ambit of the Lokpal? Where do you and your party stand on that?
Well, in my article I have not expressed a view, so my personal opinion since the party has not expressed an opinion on this, is as far as conduct within the House is concerned, you've asked a particular question, you've delivered a particular speech. These are all areas of matters of parliamentary sovereignty. The authority to judge them is only Parliament and no other agency. But having said this, I am one of those who believe that the JMM judgment of the Supreme Court is a wrong judgment.
And for the audience's sake, that's the judgment that exonerates, in a sense, the bribe taker, but punishes the bribe giver.
That apart, and I had even expressed the view at the time of cash for vote scan, as far as 2008 was concerned, bribery outside the House is not a proceeding inside the House.
Except for the fact that the reason why the bribe taker was exonerated is because it was associated with his voting inside the House. And because that has immunity, corruption was not applied.
Bribery outside the House itself, as far as an MP is concerned, is an independent.
But what about a reflection of the bribery outside the House in the behavior of the MP inside? Should that not be covered?
According to me, if there is a receipt of an unlawful remuneration outside the House, irrespective of the purpose for it has been received, it's an offence under the Prevention of Corruption
You seem to be, in other words, saying that the immunity that the MP is granted under 105(2) wouldn't apply if there is a link between what he does inside the House with bribery outside the House.
Even if there is a link, the act outside the House is an independent offence complete by itself. Somebody gives me money outside the parliamentary premises, at my residence, let us say, that itself is an offence.
Are you therefore also saying that if you cannot link what happens inside the House with something that happens outside the House, then any act of alleged corruption inside the House is not going to be under the ambit of the Lokpal?
Any corruption inside the House, for reasons of parliamentary sovereignty, has to be within the jurisdiction of Parliament.
Can I tell you why people would find that difficult to accept? Many people say that the principal source of political corruption are MPs. They need vast sums of money, well above the legal limit to win elections, and then when they win, there is an enormous compulsion to make up what they've had to spend. That's where
therefore
corruption
the remedy with the people is to vote the MPs out.
But that remedy is not in people's hands.
The remedy with the law is to prosecute the MP for receiving that illegal gratification outside the House. What the MP speaks inside the House, it's only the Speaker or the Chairman of the House which can have an authority, not a third party.
And at all costs you're going to keep the Lokpal out of that sphere.
According to me, my feeling of what the political parties and the MPs feel, and ultimately they are the ones who legislate, that what MPs speak inside the House, no democracy will ever accept.
In other words, MPs will act and vote to protect themselves inside the House?
No, MPs will vote to protect parliamentary sovereignty.
That's the one way of putting it. The other is to protect themselves.
No, I'm conceding the other half. If they receive money outside, that's actionable by a Lokpal or by an agency.
Let's take a break at that point. When we come back, I want to talk to you about the appointment procedure, and then beyond that, I want to talk to you about deadlines and fasts. We'll be back in a moment's time. See you after the break. Welcome back to Devil's Advocate and an exclusive interview with Arun Jaitley. Mr. Jaitley, you also have a serious concern about the appointment procedure for the Lokpal. The 5 ministers draft sets up a committee which is predominantly political with a fair representation of the opposition as well, but you find that objectionable. I put this to you. Since you're a politician yourself, why do you object to politicians dominating the committee? One would think you'd welcome that.
Well, I have no difficulty with politicians being on the appointment panel. But my difficulty is that the government minister's bill is loaded in favor of the government. In order to give a numerical edge to the government, they put people like cabinet secretary, a scientist. Now, what does a scientist have to do with an appointment?
You might be being unfair to the scientist. He may not necessarily vote with the government. That's your assumption.
The scientist may be a very great man. He makes a great contribution to the country. But he's certainly not concerned with the appointment of a Lokpal.
So it's inappropriate rather than something
I
that
don't think his
the
post
government
has any nexus to the purpose.
Would you be happier if the representation on this committee from the opposition was greater, but the political dominance remained? Would that
satisfy? I have no
satisfy?
difficulty with that formulation.
So
these are all matters of discussion. You can work out a via media, but government domination on this committee will destroy the credibility and legitimacy of the Lokpal.
Anna Hazare's team has a very different response to the 5 ministers committee. They say that political dominance, which you accept, is something they find difficult to swallow. They want instead people like the CAG and the CEC. Would that be acceptable to you?
Well, I think we can consider all this in the course of any serious discussion which takes place. But please remember, we in India have CAGs and CECs who are also appointed only by the government, that's the Prime Minister.
But look at the behavior of Vinod Rai, look at the behavior of the last 6 CECs. Well, they are quite independent, they are irksome to the government.
We've had some great CAGs and CECs. We also have some people occupying such offices who've been reasonably pliable. Therefore, as a concept, government nominees on this committee can't be 60% as the government drafter suggested. Therefore, what the civil society representatives are saying, what the government is saying, I think you have to work out a via media wherein the government domination doesn't exist. There are other sections of representation so that you can get the best from the system who can become members of the party.
I understand that. Let's now come to this issue of deadlines. Anna Hazare has said that if the bill is not passed by August the 15th, he will launch another dharna. Do you believe that the bill can be passed within 2 weeks of presentation in Parliament?
Realistically, it appears difficult. It appears difficult because the legislative mechanism is, if the government introduces this bill in Parliament, and government is all likely may introduce something very similar to what the ministers have suggested, with or without some alterations, a bill of this kind logically would go to the parliamentary standing committee.
Is that essential in this case?
You see, a standing committee can be waived, but in a landmark legislation which is so vital to the system, it is in larger public interest that the standing committee considers it.
And therefore, if the standing committee is essential, are we talking about the passage not happening till the winter session?
What most political parties felt in the all-party meeting, you must introduce it immediately, get the standing committee to work immediately. It may be difficult to pass it in the monsoon session, but obviously pass it by the winter session.
Is there in fact a deadline that you'd like to set, that even if it slips to the winter session, it must be passed by the 1st of January?
I think there must be an honest endeavor to have a complete, holistic discussion and debate, introduce it in the monsoon session and positively pass it in the winter session.
With a deadline of the 1st of January 2012?
I don't want to give a deadline to Parliament because it's not fair to do that, but that should be an honest endeavor unless something very unusual happens.
Now let's come to this question of fast. Anna Hazare has said that if the bill that the government tables in the Lok Sabha is not acceptable to him, he will launch a fast on August the 16th. But given that what really counts is not the bill that's tabled in Parliament, but the bill that Parliament passes, which could be very different to what the government tables.
Well, I'll tell you.
Is it right to launch a fast?
I think members of the civil society and others should be assured that the bill which is eventually passed at times is very different from what's introduced. Because India has a practice of standing committees, which is very similar to the American practice, where the real serious discussion took place. And in 9 cases out of 10, standing committees return a unanimous report. A lot of suggestions are incorporated, compromise drafts are prepared.
Which the government then has to accept.
And which the opposition also forces on. And today you have a composition of both houses of parliament where the strengths are very evenly matched.
Absolutely. So I'll repeat my question. If therefore Anna Hazare plans to launch a fast because he doesn't like what the government has tabled, ignoring the fact that what Parliament passes could be very different, would you support a fast that he launches?
Well, I think I would like to merely say this, that civil societies do bring pressures on government and establishments.
But will you support a fast?
Well, I'll have to see the context in which, if the government does nothing and somebody is protesting, he may well claim a right to protest. But if this matter is moving as per the schedule, then I'm sure as a responsible leader of the civil society, he'll also reconsider it.
He should also reconsider it.
Well, I think it will depend on what the intention of the government is. I can't advise the civil society to protest or not to protest, but I do hope that the government moves in the direction of an independent, effective Lokpal, and civil society then retains some element of
One last question. Can Anna Hazare insist that he must get everything he wants, and if he doesn't, he'll go on a fast?
I think civil society groups are essentially pressure groups for their own conviction.
But can they insist on everything they want?
Well, they may normally not get everything, but they are entitled to put their pressures on the system so that the system acts. You can't take away the right to campaign and crusade away from the civil society. You may not necessarily agree with everything that they want.
All right, Arun Jaitley, a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.